The late afternoon light slanted through the high windows of the Delta Sky Club at JFK's Terminal 4, warm enough to make the glass glow, but soft enough that no one squinted. A low jazz trio murmured from the ceiling speakers, brushed snare, upright bass, the kind of piano that sounded like it knew how to keep a secret. Agents moved quietly at the reception desk. A bartender polished stemware as if every flute were going to a museum. The whole place ran on unspoken rules. Use your inside voice, keep your elbows in, don't take calls on speaker. Naomi Whitaker liked that kind of order. She sat near the floor-to-ceiling windows, one leg tucked neatly over the other, a navy jumpsuit that made packing easy and choices easier. Diamond studs, nothing else loud. Her carry-on was a slim black rectangle that could have passed for a portfolio. Inside, it was half a life. Chargers, a silk scarf, a leather journal with a ribbon tucked between pages of notes about tomorrow's review in London. The flight would be business first, then a few days outside the city in borrowed quiet. She'd been telling herself to schedule quiet the way people schedule meetings. Otherwise, it never showed up. A gate tug nosed an aircraft across the tarmac like a patient ox. Naomi watched the choreography. The marshalers with orange wands, the ground crew passing signals, the nose wheel settling on a chalked line as if the pilot were threading a needle from 50 feet up. She had been in love with that ballet since childhood, before she knew the names, before she knew how many hands it took to get a plane into the sky. A club attendant passed and set a glass of sparkling water on the side table. "Anything else I can get you, ma'am?" "This is perfect, thank you," Naomi said, the easy smile of someone who noticed how carefully other people did their jobs. A couple drifted into the lounge with the kind of arrival that made still air ruffle. The woman led, an expensive breeze in a cream sheath and a belt that declared its logo before she did. Gold clinked at her wrist, hair sprayed into a helmet that would have survived a thunderstorm. The man came a step behind, a shade too red in the face for his polo, like he'd jogged the last 100 yards and regretted it. The front desk agent scanned their boarding passes and gestured them inside. The woman didn't look at the agent at all. Her eyes were on the room, cataloging, slotting people into categories the way a grocery scanner slots barcodes into totals. "Richard," she said over her shoulder, "try not to drift. You know how you get." "Sure, honey," he murmured, gaze sliding toward the buffet where a neat platoon of cheeses waited on black slate. Naomi didn't flinch when the woman's look landed on her. You felt that kind of gaze. It came like a draft under a door. Curiosity first, then assessment, then something like dismissal, like a stamp coming down on a form, denied. And the form happened to be a person. Naomi met it for a heartbeat and offered a small nod. The same nod she gave flight attendants who remembered her seat preference, then let her eyes return to the window. The jet outside gave a shiver as the air cart disconnected, a signal of systems turning inward, readying for their own power. She liked that moment, too. The couple chose seats across from her. So many empty chairs, but those specifically. The woman set a large handbag on the seat with a thud meant to be heard. She didn't sit so much as establish a position. The man hovered, then sank into the chair as if relieved to have done something right. "It's charming," the woman said to no one and everyone, the vowels long. "For an airport lounge." Naomi paged her journal open with a fingertip. A few lines waited in clean black ink. Heathrow ops review. Catering delays blamed on supplier. Ask about weekend crew mix. She considered whether to jot down a thought about the training module update she'd skimmed that morning. More scenario-based, more human, less policy recitation. People learned better when the story felt real, when it sounded like a day they might actually have. The woman leaned toward her companion, voice pitched to be a whisper, but carrying like perfume. "They let anyone in here now. Points, I suppose. Completely changes the experience." Richard made an interested sound at a wedge of manchego. Naomi took a sip of water and let the bubbles pop and fade on her tongue. There were choices in moments like this. Rise to it and feed it. Ignore it and risk encouraging a second act. Or occupy that narrow middle. Signal heard, boundaries intact, without giving away more than you meant to. She closed the journal, placed the pen exactly across the ribbon, and looked up. The woman's smile was a mannequin's, pleasant, fixed, not connected to any warmth behind the eyes. "Isn't it something?" she said brightly. "The view?" Naomi asked and glanced toward the windows. "The access," the woman said, with a little flourish, as if describing a private club. "We like to start a trip in places that remind us we've earned it. Don't we, Richard?" "Sure do," he said, the words landing like shoes kicked off by the door. Naomi considered the line on the page about sound like a day they might actually have. She wasn't in the mood to teach, not in a lounge with jazz and white orchids and a boarding call still 40 minutes off. A staffer rolled by with fresh pastries and replenished the fruit tray. Someone laughed softly 3 couches over. An older gentleman in a navy blazer adjusted his readers and began writing a grocery list in careful block letters. Milk, peaches, coffee, on the back of a meeting agenda. The woman, Prescott, Naomi would later hear her called, picked up a magazine she had no intention of reading and let it flap shut. "Richard, be a dear and get me a cappuccino. Dry foam. They never do it properly." "On it," he said, grateful to be dispatched. Prescott watched him go, and then let her eyes swing back, as if drawn by a magnet, to the one person in the room she'd already decided did not belong. She leaned forward, elbows on knees, the way a coach leans into a huddle. "You traveling for business?" she asked. The pause was a tiny blade. "A little of both," Naomi said. She didn't add more. Sometimes people mistook quiet for empty. She had learned to let them. "Europe?" Prescott asked, as if testing whether Naomi knew how to pronounce it. "London," Naomi said. "How lovely!" "We adore the Connaught," Prescott said at once, because a person like that cannot let the word London pass without a credential pinned to it. "The martinis, Richard says they're practically medicinal." Richard reappeared with a cappuccino that had, in fact, very dry foam. Prescott didn't notice his success. She tasted, made a face, and then drank it anyway. Her bracelet clicked against the porcelain in a small, sharp rhythm. Naomi's phone buzzed once with a discreet calendar nudge. Car to gate 12 min prior. She liked to be last in the first-class lane. It conserved patience. You could only spend so much of it in a day, and you never knew when the bill would come due. "Have you been to the Cotswolds?" Prescott asked suddenly. "That's where we're headed after London. Friends with a place off the green. It's terribly quaint." "Sounds peaceful," Naomi said. "It is if you know where to go," Prescott said, and smiled like someone teaching a child which fork to use. Naomi turned a page of her journal, not to write, but to make a sound that said the conversation could end now without anyone losing face. Outside, a long-haul flight taxied past and gave a little salute blast that made a toddler near the window clap his hands. His grandfather clapped too, and then glanced around, embarrassed, and laughed at himself. Naomi liked him on sight. "Richard," Prescott said, still looking at Naomi, "do you remember that time in Paris when they accidentally put us in the wrong line at check-in? I almost thought I'd die. Imagine me—" "Terrible," Richard said obediently. Naomi closed the journal and stood to stretch, a small, practical movement that also reset the air around her. She adjusted the strap of her carry-on. The attendant who had brought the water noticed and came by with the kind of attention that looked like intuition. "Dr. Whitaker, would you like me to check your boarding time?" the attendant asked, and then caught herself. Not everyone liked being addressed by titles in public spaces. "Apologies, your flight is still on time." "Appreciate it, Mia," Naomi said, reading the name tag and giving it back to the person wearing it. Prescott's eyelashes gave the smallest flick. People heard names, and they heard the way names were said. They heard doctor, and sometimes something in them bristled before their brain had time to ask why. The boarding announcement for the London flight came a few minutes later, the agent's voice smooth and even, a practiced lullaby. Delta One would begin in 5 minutes. Families and those needing extra assistance could pre-board now. Naomi stayed seated, finished her water, and watched the first wave compress into the glass arch of the jet bridge like toothpaste in a tube. Prescott stood immediately, gathering her bag with the sweep of a general, and pointed Richard toward the door with 2 fingers. Then she turned, as if remembering a final lesson she had been meaning to impart. "It must be exciting for you," she said to Naomi, friendly as frosting. "First class, it's a bit of a world, isn't it?" Naomi let the corners of her mouth lift. "It's a comfortable way to travel." "For those who are accustomed," Prescott said, and then winced theatrically. "Oh, listen to me, I'm just terrible today. It's the excitement, new places." "Safe travels," Naomi said, and meant it. You didn't have to like a person to wish for their safe landing. The sky was big enough for everyone's better angels. When Naomi rose to board, she felt the familiar quiet settle over her shoulders, the habit of moving through thresholds without fanfare. She scanned her pass, thanked the agent, wished the toddler a good nap, and stepped into the tunnel. The air changed in the jet bridge, cooler, scented like aluminum and logistics. Ahead, a flight attendant smiled with the practiced warmth of someone who meant it and was paid to both. "Welcome aboard," the attendant said. "We'll have you comfortable in just a moment." Naomi's seat was 2A. She placed the carry-on in the little closet just inside the suite, touched the leather with the kind of gratitude that comes from remembering cramped economy flights paid for in coins and compromises, and set her journal on the side ledge with the care you give to an object that holds more than paper. The cabin's palette was warm wood and charcoal, light stitched in soft seams along the ceiling. A businessman in 1A folded his newspaper and made a call to postpone a meeting without sounding like he cared much either way. Across the aisle, a young woman in 2D took a selfie with the window shade reflecting twin moons of her eyes. A familiar voice came from the aisle. "Well, look at that," Prescott said, mock amazement pouring like syrup. "We're neighbors." Richard slid into the seat across, grateful for barriers built by designers who had imagined every way human beings could annoy each other and tried to soften the effects. Naomi adjusted her seatbelt and looked up as a flight attendant stopped at her suite. This one she knew. "Ms. Harper," Naomi said, and the woman's face brightened with recognition that had no awkwardness in it. "Dr. Whitaker," Emily Harper replied, professional warmth, no exclamation points. "It's good to have you with us. May I bring you a glass of champagne before departure? We have the 008 you prefer." "Thank you," Naomi said. Emily leaned slightly, the angle of a colleague with a quick note. "Crew is briefed. The captain will stop by to say hello before push." "Appreciated," Naomi said, and the exchange took exactly as long as it needed to. Prescott had turned at the sound of "doctor" the way a dog turns at the crinkle of a treat bag. Her smile was back, thinner now. She lifted her eyebrows like a stage cue and spoke to Emily with the faux casual tone of someone asking for directions to a room they already knew the way to. "We'll have champagne as well." "Of course," Emily said, without a tremor of put-in-your-place in her voice. "I'll be right with you." Naomi set her headphones on the ledge and watched the runway life through the oval. The engines of a departing plane came up to a long, cohesive roar. She felt something lower in her chest answer the sound, a recognition. Machines and people both had a way of humming when they did what they were built to do. Prescott leaned into the aisle, lowered her voice in a way that wasn't low, and said to Emily, "I don't like to make trouble, but I'm a little concerned about some of the other passengers." Richard stared very hard at the safety card, as if it were a crossword he was determined to finish. Emily's smile didn't fade, but a pause opened inside it. "All our first-class passengers are confirmed, ma'am." "Are they?" Prescott said. "It just seems unusual. The familiarity, the special treatment. We paid full fare. I assume others did as well." Naomi kept her gaze on the window, chin tipped slightly down, a posture that in another context might have looked like prayer. She wasn't praying. She was counting down from a number that let patience land softly instead of snapping mid-air. She got to 7 and stopped. It was enough. Emily returned with Naomi's champagne, placed it with a small bow that was habit more than theater, and said, "Your menu is on the ledge, Dr. Whitaker. Chef has prepared the sea bass you enjoy, but I'll confirm in case you prefer to change." "Sea bass is perfect," Naomi said. "Thank you." The cork's sigh seemed to tighten something in Prescott rather than ease it. She sat back and folded her arms. "Well," she said to Richard loudly enough to invite an audience, "some people get lucky, that's all." Naomi lifted the flute, watched the bubbles rise like disciplined schoolchildren in a line, and took one sip. The taste was bright and familiar, like hearing the first few notes of a song you loved enough not to hum along to. She set it down, straightened the small edge of the napkin under the stem, and buckled her belt. "Cabin crew, prepare for departure," came the announcement. The doors thumped closed in a rhythm she could feel in her ribs. They pushed back. The wing outside flexed like a shoulder, rolling into its work. Richard cleared his throat. "Nice champagne," he said to no one. "It is," Naomi said pleasantly, because kindness cost less than most things. Prescott opened her handbag and rummaged, pulled out a travel-sized bottle of hand lotion, and applied it as if she were performing a demonstration. "Richard, remind me to speak to someone about the boarding process. The lines were sloppy." Richard nodded. The plane began its lumbering taxi, those first heavy steps before the run. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment and thought of the countryside she'd promised herself. Hedgerows like stitches, a porch where afternoon light stayed late, a day where no one said her name because they needed a decision. She opened them at the tiny shiver in the cabin that meant flaps adjusting. Emily came by to check shoulder harnesses. "All set here?" "All set," Naomi said. Prescott let her smile show teeth now. "It must be a dream for you," she said, not looking at Emily, but making sure Emily could hear. "All of this. It's terribly overwhelming at first, but you get used to it." Naomi looked at her, really looked, the way she looked at weather systems and contracts and engines that made a sound she didn't like. Prescott's face was perfect in the way a store window is perfect. It asked not to be touched and reflected back exactly what it wanted to see. "Comfort is a habit," Naomi said gently, "like discomfort." For the first time, Prescott's expression flickered, a record that skipped because a grain of dust had landed in the groove. She recovered quickly, pulled the blanket up over her knees with a tisk that sounded practiced, and turned to Richard. "We'll sleep after dinner," she announced, as if making a plan the captain might consult. The taxi paused. A takeoff cleared, the captain released the brakes, and the engines unspooled into that long, even thunder that never failed to steady Naomi, even when everything else felt like weather. She sat back, let the force press her into the generous seat, and allowed herself one quiet thought that tasted like foreshadowing. There were days you could see a storm from miles out and steer around it, and then there were days you met it head-on because the only way out was through. When the aircraft leveled and the seatbelt sign chimed, the cabin woke into its small routines. Menus opened, reading lights pinged to life. The scent of warm bread drifted from the galley. Emily moved like a metronome set to human tempo. A refill here, a question there. Naomi signed a single form the purser brought for a procedural update, her pen a quick, clean line. Across the aisle, Prescott leaned forward and caught Naomi's eyes as if plucking a thread and tying it to herself. "We should toast," she said brightly, "to new experiences." Naomi considered the glass at her fingertips, the little constellation of bubbles, the way the cabin's light made the gold inside glow. She thought of the man in the lounge making a grocery list on the back of a meeting agenda. Milk, peaches, coffee. She thought of landing right. "To safe flights," Naomi said. "To safe flights," Richard echoed, and took a sip like a man in a desert gulping rain. Prescott raised her glass a fraction, then set it down untouched. "And to knowing one's place," she added softly, like a private joke she wanted to become an inside one. Naomi did not pick it up. Some jokes deserve to wither on the vine. A little later, when the crew began laying out table linens with that soft, efficient flourish that felt halfway between restaurant and ritual, Prescott stood. She adjusted her belt again, though it hadn't moved, smoothed a wrinkle that wasn't there, and stepped into the aisle with a smile that turned heads the way a dropped fork does in a quiet room. She took the seat directly across from Naomi, angled her knees as if for a photograph, and folded her hands on the small table. "Mind if we get better acquainted?" she asked, the question shaped like courtesy and filled with something else entirely. Her smile held steady, bright and practiced, a lighthouse beam that forgot it was supposed to guide, not interrogate. Naomi Carter adjusted her seatbelt as the flight attendant made the final boarding announcements. The hum of the Airbus A350's engines was almost soothing, a low, steady vibration through the plush carpet under her feet. She'd been in this cabin countless times before, her cabin, but tonight felt different. The air carried a subtle electric tension, the kind you sense before a summer storm. Across the aisle, Eleanor Prescott was settling in, though settling might have been a generous word. She moved with the air of someone who believed the world was a stage, and she was the lead. Her diamond tennis bracelet flashed each time she gestured, and her voice carried just enough to make eavesdropping unavoidable. "You'd think they'd be a bit more selective," she murmured to her husband Charles, but her gaze was locked on Naomi. "First class used to mean something." Naomi caught the words, though she kept her eyes on the tablet in her lap, scrolling through her notes for the upcoming London Investor Summit. She had no desire to engage, not yet. But Eleanor wasn't the type to let silence win. Moments later, the older woman leaned slightly into the aisle, a smile that was all teeth stretching across her face. "First time up here, dear." The tone was sweet on the surface, but sharp underneath. Naomi looked up, meeting Eleanor's eyes with a calm that was both disarming and unreadable. "No," she said simply. "Ah," Eleanor replied undeterred. "Must have saved up quite a bit for it, I imagine. It's lovely, isn't it? All this?" Her hand made a slow, sweeping motion at the crystal stemware, the ambient lighting, the champagne chilling in silver buckets. Naomi let the question hang for a heartbeat before answering. "It's a comfortable way to travel." Something flickered across Eleanor's face, a tiny disruption in her perfectly rehearsed expressions. She had expected awkwardness or defensiveness, not this easy, unshaken composure. The flight attendant, Chloe, approached just then, holding a bottle with practiced grace. "Dr. Carter, your 2008 Dom Perignon is ready. Shall I pour you a glass before takeoff?" Naomi smiled warmly. "Thank you, Chloe. That would be perfect." Eleanor's head snapped toward the exchange. "Doctor?" she repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it unpalatable. "Oh, how impressive." Her smile returned, but this time it didn't reach her eyes. Charles shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing to disappear into the wide leather seat. "Eleanor," he started, but she waved him off. No, I'm just curious," Eleanor pressed on. "What is it you're a doctor of, exactly? Something exotic?" Naomi didn't flinch. "Physics." For a moment, silence pooled between them, filled only by the faint chime of the seatbelt sign and the rustle of a newspaper somewhere in the cabin. Then Eleanor gave a short laugh, the kind people use when they think they've caught you out. "Well," she said, "I suppose anything is possible these days." Naomi glanced toward the window, watching the ground crew move with precision outside. It wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated. It wouldn't be the last. But tonight, she suspected, Eleanor Prescott was about to discover exactly how costly an assumption could be. The engines roared to life, and as the plane began its slow pushback from the gate, Chloe returned with Naomi's champagne. Eleanor, meanwhile, reached for the call button above her seat, her expression one of determined purpose. Somewhere deep inside, Naomi felt the shift, the moment when an encounter stops being an annoyance and becomes an inevitable confrontation. And she was ready. The A350 had barely left the ground before Eleanor Prescott decided it was time to stake her claim over the first-class cabin. She leaned across the aisle again, ignoring the gentle turbulence and her husband's quiet, pleading, "Please, Eleanor." "You know," she began, her tone pitched just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "it's remarkable how far frequent flyer miles can get people these days. Practically anyone can end up here if they collect enough points." Naomi set down her champagne flute, the pale gold liquid catching the cabin's warm lighting. She didn't immediately respond. Silence, she had learned long ago, was often the most effective first strike. But Eleanor wasn't interested in silence. "I just think," she continued, "that some people might appreciate the experience more if they understood what it really takes to get here. Years of hard work, sacrifice, not just luck or connections." Her eyes swept over Naomi's simple but elegant navy jumpsuit, the understated diamond studs lingering with pointed meaning. Chloe, the flight attendant, appeared with the grace of someone trained to extinguish conflict before it ignited. "Mrs. Prescott, can I offer you some champagne as well?" Eleanor's eyes stayed on Naomi even as she answered. "Yes, dear. Make it the Dom Perignon, like hers. I assume we're all getting the same service, though some of us have earned it." Charles winced. Naomi took a slow breath, keeping her voice steady. "Mrs. Prescott, you seem very concerned about how I got here." Eleanor tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Not concerned, dear. Just curious." Naomi leaned back, her expression calm but her gaze sharp. "Curiosity is one thing. Disrespect is another." The businessman in 1A glanced up from his newspaper. A woman in sunglasses 2 rows ahead subtly adjusted her seat to listen. The air in the cabin had shifted, no longer polite, but charged. Eleanor's smile hardened. "I'm simply pointing out that standards matter. First class should be for a certain caliber of passenger." Chloe's polite mask wavered, her hand tightening on the tray she held. "All of our first-class passengers are confirmed and ticketed, Mrs. Prescott. Everyone here belongs here." Eleanor gave a little laugh, sharp as glass. "If you say so. I suppose the airline has to fill these seats somehow." Naomi's eyes stayed locked on hers. "You're right about one thing, Mrs. Prescott. Standards do matter, which is why I suggest you start meeting them." It was the kind of reply that didn't need volume. It had weight, enough that the row went quiet, the hum of the engines the only sound. Eleanor's face flushed. She opened her mouth to retort, but just then Chloe knelt by Naomi's seat, speaking in a low, respectful tone that still carried to Eleanor's ears. "Dr. Carter, your dinner order has been confirmed. The chef has already prepared the saffron risotto, just as you requested." The title, Doctor, hung in the air like a gavel strike. Eleanor's fingers tightened around her champagne glass. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but it didn't last long. "Oh," she said lightly, "a doctor. How unexpected." Then, with a sugary smile, "What is it you practice exactly? Something fashionable?" Naomi met her gaze, unblinking. "Physics." The word landed like a stone in still water. And as the ripples spread through the cabin, Naomi knew this wasn't going to end with polite conversation. The Airbus A350 lifted smoothly into the late afternoon sky, banking over the shimmering coastline before settling into its climb. The first-class cabin was quiet, except for the low hum of the Rolls-Royce engines and the occasional soft chime from the crew's service panels. It was the kind of space designed to feel like a private club in the clouds, rich walnut veneer along the walls, ambient lighting shifting to a warm golden hue, and seats that cocooned each passenger in a private world. The scent of fresh orchids mingled with the faint aroma of baked bread from the galley. Naomi Carter had just taken her first sip of champagne when the trouble began. Across the aisle, Eleanor Prescott adjusted the collar of her ivory cashmere sweater and turned slightly toward her husband. Her diamond tennis bracelet clinked as she gestured, subtle enough to look casual, but purposeful enough to be noticed. "You know," she said, her voice pitched to carry over the engine noise. "It's remarkable how far frequent flyer miles can get people these days. Practically anyone can end up here if they collect enough points." Charles Prescott winced, looking down at his glass of sparkling water. "Eleanor," he murmured, but she ignored him. Naomi's eyes flicked toward her, not in challenge, but in the cool, assessing way one might glance at an incoming storm cloud. She returned her attention to the leather-bound notebook in her lap, letting the comment hang unanswered. Eleanor, undeterred, leaned slightly farther into the aisle. "I just think," she continued, "that some people might appreciate the experience more if they understood what it really takes to get here. Years of hard work, sacrifice, not just luck or connections." Her gaze traveled over Naomi's navy jumpsuit, lingering for half a beat too long on the understated diamond studs in her ears, then back up to her face. Chloe, the flight attendant, appeared with the grace of someone who'd navigated tense cabins before. "Mrs. Prescott, can I offer you some champagne as well?" "Yes, dear," Eleanor said, eyes still locked on Naomi. "Make it the Dom Perignon, like hers. I assume we're all getting the same service, though some of us have earned it." A couple of passengers in nearby suites exchanged glances. The businessman in 1A folded his newspaper just enough to peek over the edge. Naomi placed her champagne flute gently on the table, the crystal making a soft click. She looked up, her expression calm but voice measured. "Mrs. Prescott, you seem very concerned about how I got here." Eleanor tilted her head, feigning innocence. "Not concerned, dear. Just curious." Naomi leaned back, her posture relaxed, yet deliberate. Curiosity is one thing, disrespect is another. The air between them felt taut, like a string pulled too tight. Chloe's polite smile faltered slightly as she looked from one woman to the other. "All of our first-class passengers are confirmed and ticketed, Mrs. Prescott. Everyone here belongs here." Eleanor gave a short, humorless laugh. "If you say so. I suppose the airline has to fill these seats somehow." Naomi's gaze didn't waver. "You're right about one thing, Mrs. Prescott. Standards do matter, which is why I suggest you start meeting them." "The reply landed with quiet precision, not loud, not aggressive, but heavy enough to draw the attention of the entire row. Eleanor's cheeks flushed faintly. She opened her mouth to fire back, but Chloe knelt by Naomi's seat first, speaking in a tone both respectful and clear enough for Eleanor to hear. "Dr. Carter, your dinner order has been confirmed. Chef has already prepared the saffron risotto, just as you requested. The title, Doctor, hung in the air like a gavel strike. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Eleanor's face, quickly masked by a brittle smile. "Oh, a doctor. How unexpected. What is it you practice exactly? Something fashionable?" Naomi held her gaze, her voice steady. "Physics." It was a single word, but it landed like a stone in a still pond, rippling through the silent cabin. The man in 1A lowered his newspaper completely now. The woman in sunglasses shifted to face forward, but Naomi could feel her listening. Eleanor, however, wasn't finished. She turned to Charles. "Isn't that interesting, dear? A physicist on our flight." Charles' reply was little more than a sigh. Naomi didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she picked up her notebook again, flipping it open with deliberate calm. The ink on the page was a series of equations, complex, elegant curves of logic and calculation. Eleanor's eyes darted toward them, but she didn't understand what she was seeing. Still, Naomi could sense the unease building. She had encountered women like Eleanor before, people who wielded entitlement like a weapon, assuming it would always strike true. What they never accounted for was meeting someone who wouldn't flinch. The cabin service resumed, but the energy had shifted. Conversations were quieter, glances more frequent. Eleanor sipped her champagne, but her eyes kept drifting toward Naomi's seat, as though unable to let go of the idea that this woman didn't belong. Naomi, for her part, sat in the quiet certainty of her own worth. But in the back of her mind, a thought stirred. This was only the beginning. The cabin had settled into that gentle rhythm that follows takeoff. Belts unclicked, shoes nudged off, the quiet choreography of linens laid, and glasses refreshed. Naomi Whitaker watched the arc of light along the wing and felt the plane's climb flatten into cruise, a small easing in the chest that anyone who flies often recognizes. She could have opened her laptop. She could have lost herself in numbers and memos. Instead, she chose stillness, the kind that lets you take the temperature of a room without ever laying a hand on it. Across the aisle, Linda Prescott had traded the brittle smile for something harder. She had tasted Dr. Whitaker, rolled it around like a seed, and found it stuck in her teeth. Richard kept his eyes on his napkin, folding one edge over the other, and then, as if embarrassed by the neatness of it, unfolding it again. Emily Harper moved with steady competence between sweets, the soft swing of a service apron, the nod that asked and answered at once. "Do you need anything? Are you all right?" "Excuse me," Linda said, smiling at Emily with the bright heat of a desk lamp. "I don't mean to make trouble, but I'm concerned." Emily paused, tray perfectly level. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Prescott?" "It's just that—" Linda angled her chin toward Naomi while pretending not to. "There appears to be some, unusual familiarity between crew and certain passengers. Special meals, special greetings. I know how these seats are supposed to be allocated. We paid full fare." "Everyone in this cabin is ticketed and confirmed," Emily said, a shade firmer, "and we extend personalized service to all of our guests." Linda's laugh was short and sharp. "Of course, it's just, there are programs these days, lotteries, radio contests. I'd hate to see the experience diluted. First class has standards." Naomi lifted her glass, then set it down untouched. She looked at Emily, not for help, but to make it clear that the next words weren't a whisper passed through a proxy. "Mrs. Prescott," she said evenly, "you've made comments about how I got here, whether I belong, and what you think this cabin should look like. You've involved the crew. I'm asking you to stop." The businessman in 1A lowered his newspaper completely, an open declaration of witness. 2 rows up, a young woman in oversized sunglasses stilled her hand halfway to her water glass. Richard took a breath that sounded like it hurt. Linda met Naomi's calm with volume. "I don't respond well to lectures," she said, "especially from people who—" She stopped just short of saying the thing she wanted to say, but the shape of it sat there between them, unmistakable. "I feel unsafe," she announced, suddenly louder. "This is threatening." The word changed the air. Emily's face flickered, alarm, then training. "Ma'am, please take your seat. The captain has asked that the aisle remain clear while we begin service." "I will not sit," Linda said, standing straighter, as if altitude could be mistaken for authority. "I'm a diamond with your partner airline. I have status. Move her. Put her in the back where she belongs." Richard shut his eyes. "Linda, please." Naomi unbuckled her belt with a small click that carried like a chime. She rose. Not a sudden movement, not showy, just a person standing in the space she had paid for, the space she occupied in more ways than one. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Mrs. Prescott," she said, "I have been quiet because I respect quiet. I asked you to stop because I prefer to leave people their dignity, even when they don't offer me mine. You're now harassing the crew, and you've claimed to feel threatened to get your way. That's the last line." She turned to Emily, not hurried, not dramatic, simply precise. "Miss Harper, please go to the flight deck," she said. "Tell Captain Hayes the owner is on board. Inform him we have a code 3 passenger disturbance in first class, and I request his presence in the cabin." Emily's eyes widened by a fraction, not surprise exactly, recognition. She nodded once, a tight professional gesture, and walked forward, knuckles brushing the latching edge of the galley cart as she passed. The cabin hushed. Even the hum of the engines seemed to step back to make room. Linda actually laughed, a high, brittle sound. "Owner?" she said. "Of what exactly? The glass? Please, this is ridiculous." Naomi didn't answer her. She stood, shoulders loose, head level, and let stillness do the work. Richard looked from one woman to the other and then down at his hands. The flush in his face drained to something gray. The cockpit door opened with that weighted, deliberate motion that always says more than the swing of a hinge. This is secured. This is serious. Captain Robert Hayes stepped into the aisle, uniform crisp, hair silvered at the temples in a way that made passengers instinctively trust him. His gaze swept the cabin and landed on Naomi with the instant focus of a man who knows where responsibility lives. "Dr. Whitaker," he said, voice even, "I'm sorry for the disturbance." "Thank you for coming, Captain," Naomi replied, as if they were in a boardroom and a meeting had begun. Linda took a step as if intercepting a pass. "Captain, I'm the one being harassed here," she said. "This woman is making outrageous claims, and the crew is giving her special treatment. I insist you reseat her. I do not feel safe." Hayes regarded her not unkindly, but without patience for theater. "Ma'am, Ms. Harper reported that you questioned a passenger's right to be here and refused to follow crew instructions," he said. "That's a safety issue." "She's lying about who she is," Linda said, gesturing toward Naomi with a small, jerky movement, the kind that says the argument has outrun the evidence. Naomi addressed the captain, her voice clear and deliberate, more statement than speech. "My name is Naomi Whitaker. I'm the founder and CEO of Whitaker Group," she said. "We hold a controlling stake in this airline. My first company built the software running your IFE system. I wrote the service standards for this cabin. This aircraft, this crew, this route are all within my responsibility." She turned her head just enough to include Linda without giving her the center of the frame. "So when you ask what I have, Mrs. Prescott, what I have is the plane." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Each clause was a measured step over a bridge that had been there all along. Silence followed, the kind that rearranges a room. The man in 1A breathed out an entire paragraph. Someone farther back muttered, "Wow," very softly, like a prayer that had made it to the right address. Naomi faced Hayes again. "Captain, Mrs. Prescott has created a hostile environment for crew and guests, and she refused to comply during a critical phase of flight," she said. "Per our conditions of carriage, Section 12, subsection B, your authority includes deplaning passengers who threaten safety or comfort. I'm requesting you exercise that authority." Hayes nodded once, a decision locking into place. "Understood," he said. He turned to Linda, posture squared by decades of command. "Mrs. Prescott, Mr. Prescott, on my authority as captain, you are being denied travel on this flight. Please gather your personal belongings. We'll be returning to the gate where ground staff will meet you." Richard made a small sound, half breath, half apology, and started to rise before Linda's hand pinned him to the armrest. "You can't be serious," she said to Hayes, voice rising. "We've paid 5 figures for these seats. We have status. My husband is a senior vice president at—" "Ma'am," Hayes said, gentler than he needed to be, "this isn't about status. It's about safety and compliance. Please gather your things." Linda's mouth opened, closed, then snapped open again. "This is intimidation. We'll sue. We'll call the board. We know people." Naomi didn't respond. She'd already sat back down, belt relatched, hands quiet on the blanket, as if the weather had changed and she was simply letting the new conditions settle. Emily was at Linda's suite now, professional to the last inch. "Mrs. Prescott, I'll help with your bag," she said softly. Richard stood, finally, eyes on the carpet. "Linda, let's go," he said, the words costing him something you could hear. The captain touched the panel by the galley and spoke low to the interphone. Seconds later, the PA chimed, and the aircraft eased out of the taxi queue with a patient turn. The hush in the cabin thickened. No clink of glassware now, just the hum of systems and the small, embarrassed silence of people witnessing a thing go past the point where it could be rescued. Linda grabbed her oversized handbag and yanked at the overhead. Emily's hand was already there, steadying, the way you steady a tray or a person who doesn't know they're about to fall. Linda jerked away. "Don't touch my belongings." "As you wish," Emily said, still steady. Hayes remained exactly where he was, not looming, not retreating. He'd stood in 100 aisles and settled 100 storms. This wasn't the loudest, just the most needless. "Captain," Linda said, one last try at theater, "I'm telling you I feel threatened." Hayes glanced at Naomi, then back at Linda. "No one is threatening you," he said. "What's happening is enforcement of the rules you agreed to when you boarded." The seatbelt sign pinged on with a soft chime as the aircraft approached the gate. The forward door unlocked with a muted thunk. Every pair of eyes in the cabin lifted toward it as it cracked open and the bright, ordinary light of the jet bridge spilled in. 2 uniformed Port Authority officers appeared in the doorway, calm and neutral, hands visible, faces set in that practiced combination of courtesy and certainty that means there will be no debate about the next 5 minutes. "Mr. and Mrs. Prescott," one said, voice even. "This way, please." Hayes nodded once, stepped aside, and made a small sweep of his hand. "Gather your personal belongings," he repeated. Emily held out Linda's bag. Richard reached for his jacket with fingers that couldn't quite find the sleeve. Naomi didn't move, didn't speak. She just watched the open door, the officers standing like bookends, and the quiet gravity of a decision that had finally finished falling. The cabin found its cruise rhythm the way a town settles after supper. Voices low, lights softer, everyone busy with small rituals. A line of bread rolls warmed somewhere behind a curtain. The wing outside held the last of the sun like a saucer catching a drip of honey. Naomi Whitaker rested her hands on the edge of the console and listened to the hum that said, "The airplane was happy." Years of flying had taught her, you can hear when machines are content. It's a steady note, no strain, no wobble. It calmed people, too, if they let it. Across the aisle, Linda Prescott sat at an angle that suggested her chair was a throne. Richard had folded his napkin into a tidy square and then unfolded it again, the way nervous people handle paper when they wish it were something else. Emily Harper moved between suites with the practiced grace of someone who's been trusted to carry coffee through turbulence. She checked seatbelts, confirmed orders, swapped water for sparkling. The business traveler in 1A reread a paragraph 3 times and couldn't have said what it meant. A woman 2 rows up pretended to sleep behind sunglasses that weren't fooling anyone. "Excuse me," Linda said, pinning Emily with a smile so bright it cast shadows. "I hate to make trouble, but I'm concerned." Emily kept the tray level, kept her voice even. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Prescott?" "It's just that there seems to be a certain—" Linda fluttered a hand, searching for a word she wouldn't have to own later. "Familiarity between the crew and a particular passenger." She tipped her head toward Naomi while pretending not to. "Special meals, special attention. We paid full fare. I assume standards still mean something up here. Everyone in this cabin is ticketed and confirmed," Emily said, one notch firmer. "We extend personalized service to all our guests." Linda's laugh was the sound a glass makes when you set it down too hard. "If you say so. There are so many promotions now. Contests, lotteries. It would be a shame to see the experience diluted. First class should be for a certain caliber of traveler." Naomi let the words pass through the air like smoke and dissipate. She had a dozen replies and used none. Instead, she took a breath that filled the bottom of her lungs and set the glass back on the napkin so gently the crystal barely whispered. Restraint wasn't weakness. It was stewardship. Of the room, of her crew, of her own peace. "Mrs. Prescott," she said finally, level and quiet, "you've made comments about how I got here and whether I belong. You've involved the crew. I'm asking you to stop." The nearby suites went still in that very human way people get when a scene might happen and they don't want to star in it, but also don't want to miss it. Richard stared at his hands like they were a radio trying to tune something in. The sunglasses 2 rows up angled half an inch. 1A folded his newspaper the rest of the way and surrendered to the fact that he was reading the room now, not the markets. Linda smiled wider, as if more teeth could make the shape of her argument prettier. I don't respond well to lectures, she said, especially from people who... She paused, and the unsaid part sat on the carpet between them like a suitcase no one claimed. I feel unsafe, she announced louder. This is threatening. The word landed like a fire alarm in a quiet building. Emily's training rose to the top of her face and smoothed everything else away. Ma'am, please take your seat. The captains asked that the aisle remain clear while we begin service. I will not sit, Linda said, standing a fraction taller, mistaking altitude for authority. I'm a diamond with your partner airline. I have status. Move her. Put her in the back where she belongs. Richard's eyes squeezed shut. The breath he let out sounded like an apology he didn't know how to form. Naomi unlatched her belt with a small click that carried. She stood, not a flourish, not a performance, simply a person taking their full height and using it. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Mrs. Prescott, she said, I've been quiet because I respect quiet. I asked you to stop because I prefer to leave people their dignity even when they don't offer me mine. You're harassing the crew, and you invoked threat to get your way. That's the last line. She turned to Emily, the shift of her head precise as a switch being thrown. Miss Harper, please go to the flight deck, she said. Tell Captain Hayes the owner is on board. Inform him we have a code 3 passenger disturbance in first class, and I request his presence in the cabin. Emily's eyes flicked with recognition. Oh. And then settled back into yes. Right away, she said, and walked forward with a steadiness that made the aisle feel like it was exactly where she belonged. Linda gave a short, disbelieving laugh. Owner? Of what, exactly? She gestured at the air with her glass. That napkin? This is ridiculous. Naomi didn't reply. She kept the stillness that always made noisy people nervous. The hum of the airplane held steady. Somewhere aft, a cart thunked into its latch. The lights over the exits glowed a calm green. The cockpit door opened with a deliberate weight that said the person coming through had both authority and boundaries. Captain Robert Hayes stepped into the aisle, uniform crisp, expression professional but human, a man who'd ferried thousands of souls through thousands of miles and still took it personally that they trusted him to bring them down safe. His eyes made a quick pass of the cabin and settled on Naomi as if finding a point on a compass. Dr. Whitaker, he said, voice even. I'm sorry for the disturbance. Thank you for coming, Captain, Naomi replied, and the way they spoke to each other told everyone more than names could. Linda took a half step forward, putting herself between them like a barricade. Captain, I'm the one being harassed, she said, words gathering speed. This woman is making outrageous claims, and your crew is catering to her. I insist you reseat her. I do not feel safe. Hayes didn't frown. He didn't smile. He set the tone by refusing the theater. Ma'am, Ms. Harper reported that you questioned another passenger's right to be here and refused to follow crew instructions, he said. That's a safety and compliance issue. She's lying about who she is, Linda said, the gesture she made toward Naomi small and jerky, the kind people use when their argument has outrun their certainty. Naomi addressed Hayes, each word as clean as if she'd wiped it with a cloth before handing it over. My name is Naomi Whitaker. I'm the founder and CEO of the Whitaker Group, she said. We hold a controlling stake in this airline. My first company built the software running your entertainment system. I wrote the service standards for this cabin. This aircraft, this crew, this route are within my responsibility. She turned just enough to include Linda without giving her the stage. So when you ask what I have, Mrs. Prescott, what I have is the plane. It wasn't loud. It didn't need permission. The words slotted into place the way a door does when it finds the right frame. Silence followed, the kind that rearranges posture. 1A let out a breath and looked at his shoes like they'd told him a joke. The woman in sunglasses removed them, as if respect required naked eyes. Richard's face went the color paper goes when it's been left in a window too long. Naomi faced the captain again. Mrs. Prescott has created a hostile environment for crew and guests and refused to comply during a critical phase of flight, she said. Per the conditions of carriage, Section 12, subsection B, you're authorized to deplane passengers who threaten safety or comfort. I'm requesting you exercise that authority. Hayes's nod was small and decisive. Understood, he said. He turned to Linda and spoke in the tone flight crews use when the conversation is over, even if the words haven't caught up yet. Mrs. Prescott, Mr. Prescott, on my authority as captain, you are being denied travel on this flight. Please gather your personal belongings. We'll be returning to the gate where ground staff will meet you. Richard made a sound that was half breath, half sorry. He started to rise. Linda's hand gripped his armrest and pinned him for a second, not quite gentle. You can't be serious, she said to Hayes, volume climbing a rung. We've paid 5 figures for these seats. We have status. My husband is a senior vice president at— Ma'am, Hayes said, kinder than the moment demanded. This isn't about status. It's about safety and compliance. Please, gather your things. We'll sue, Linda snapped. We'll call the board. We know people. Naomi had already sat back down and relatched her belt. She rested her hands on the blanket and looked at the door, calm as a person waiting for weather to pass. Emily stood by Linda's suite, professional all the way to her fingertips. Mrs. Prescott, I'll help with your bag, she said, soft enough to spare dignity, firm enough to keep the plane on its rails. Richard stood, finally, eyes on the carpet. Linda, let's go, he said. And the words cost him something you could hear, some small reserve he'd been saving for a different day. The captain touched the interphone by the galley. A soft chime answered. The aircraft eased out of the takeoff queue with a patient, apologetic turn as if it could shrug. The hush in the cabin thickened. Cutlery clinked no more. A toddler somewhere aft asked, "We go back now?" And his mother whispered, "Just for a minute." Linda yanked at the overhead bin. Emily's hand was already there, steadying, the way you steady a tray, or a person, or a situation that doesn't know it's about to tip. "Don't touch my belongings," Linda snapped. "As you wish," Emily said, not retreating, not escalating. 1A cleared his throat and found nothing useful to say. The woman 2 rows up slid her sunglasses into their case with a click that sounded like punctuation. A young man in 3A angled his phone down, then thought better of it, then angled it back up with trembling restraint. He wasn't a gossip. He was a witness who hadn't decided what to do with the weight of witnessing. Hayes stayed where he was, present like a lighthouse, not a wall. He'd stood in 100 aisles and settled 100 storms. This wasn't the loudest. It was just the most avoidable. "Captain," Linda said, one last grab at theater. "I'm telling you, I feel threatened." "No one is threatening you," Hayes said, without heat. "What's happening is enforcement of the rules you agreed to when you boarded." The seatbelt sign chimed on with that small domestic chime airlines use, so it sounds less like an order and more like advice you'd be wise to take. The plane slid against the gate like a glove slipping back onto a hand. The forward door unlocked with a muted thunk. Bright, ordinary jet bridge light spilled in, daylight laced with the smell of carpet and air conditioning and the outside world. 2 Port Authority officers appeared in the doorway, uniforms neat, hands visible, posture that delicate blend of courtesy and inevitability that says this part will go the way it's going to go. No hard edges, no swagger, just the momentum of policy meeting practice. "Mr. and Mrs. Prescott," the first officer said, voice calm as a church usher. "This way, please." Hayes nodded once and stepped aside, a small gesture that somehow contained both apology and resolve. "Gather your personal belongings," he repeated, the phrase final now, like the last line in a letter you've rewritten, until it said exactly what it needed to. Emily offered Linda's bag. Richard reached for his jacket and missed the sleeve twice before finding it. Someone far back in business class asked a seatmate what was happening. The seatmate said, "Consequences," and then looked sorry for having said it out loud. Naomi didn't move. She watched the doorway, the officers steady as bookends, the quiet shift in the room as the decision finished falling and settled into the place where it belonged. For a breath, the whole cabin was balanced on the edge of two lives turning. You could feel it. How fast a story can harden into a lesson. The engine hum held, patient. The officers waited, patient. The captain was patient, too. Dignity was being offered one more time like a coat at the end of an evening. Take it, and you walk out warmer. Linda clutched her handbag and lifted her chin. Pride made her taller by half an inch. It did not make her bigger. Richard steadied the hanger with one hand and with the other touched her elbow. A small, human touch. Not pressure, not command. A request. The cabin breathed in. The door stayed open. The light from the jet bridge made a pale rectangle on the carpet, like a path somebody had laid down long before this flight left the ground. And then the moment moved. Naomi sat in seat 2A, the stem of her champagne flute resting lightly between her fingers, her gaze fixed on the front of the cabin. Across the aisle, Eleanor leaned toward Charles, her voice now a hushed whisper, though the tightness around her mouth gave her away. She was still irritated, still clinging to the same smug superiority she had displayed in the lounge, but something in the way she glanced at the other passengers told Naomi she was starting to notice the shift in the air. People were watching. Not the casual, passing glances of bored first-class travelers, but something sharper. A collective awareness that the energy in the cabin had changed. Chloe, the young flight attendant, returned from the galley with a tray of drinks for the passengers in row 3. She wore her service smile like armor, but Naomi saw the tremor in her hand as she placed a glass of sparkling water on a tray table. Chloe was a professional, but even the best training couldn't make moments like this easy. She was trying to contain a situation that was already smoldering. Up in row 1, a silver-haired man in a charcoal suit leaned toward his wife, murmuring something that made her lips press into a thin line. 2 seats back, a young Asian man in 3A, the one Naomi had noticed earlier in the lounge, tapping away at a laptop, had his phone out. Not recording, not yet, but poised as if weighing the moment. His eyes flicked between Eleanor and Naomi like he was waiting for the story to turn. The low hum of the Rolls-Royce engines was the only constant. Naomi took a slow sip of champagne, letting the cool, dry bubbles spread across her tongue. She was in no rush. The thing about people like Eleanor was that they always believed they could control the narrative by talking the loudest. But here, in this sealed, rarefied space, 30 minutes from takeoff, volume wouldn't save her. "Charles, I'm telling you, it's absurd," Eleanor murmured, though her voice still carried far enough for at least 3 rows to hear. "They just let anyone in here now?" Charles's reply was too quiet to catch, but his body language said enough. Hunched shoulders, eyes cast down, the posture of a man who'd spent years absorbing the blast radius of his wife's social combat. Naomi's lips curved slightly. She'd seen this before, the entitled spouse and the silent enabler. She had no personal interest in humiliating either of them, but she had no intention of allowing their ignorance to define her space either. When Chloe approached Naomi again, it was with a soft tone that contrasted sharply with Eleanor's brittle voice. "Dr. Carter," she said, setting a small dish of warmed mixed nuts beside the champagne, "the captain sends his regards. We'll be departing on schedule." Naomi nodded. "Thank you, Chloe." She could feel Eleanor's attention snap toward them like a heat-seeking missile. Sure enough, a beat later, Eleanor flagged Chloe down with 2 quick snaps of her manicured fingers, a gesture better suited to summoning a waiter at a country club than speaking to a first-class crew member. "Yes, Mrs. Davenport?" Chloe asked, the polite mask firmly back in place. "That champagne she's having," Eleanor said, tilting her head toward Naomi. "We'll have 2 glasses. And, forgive me, but I'm a bit concerned about certain passengers. You do check credentials for people up here, don't you?" There it was, not even coded, just blunt, saccharin-wrapped suspicion. Chloe's eyes flickered, but her tone didn't waver. "All our first-class passengers are ticketed and confirmed, ma'am." Eleanor leaned in, lowering her voice, though still loud enough for Naomi to hear every word. I just find it unusual that she's on such familiar terms with the staff. Special drinks, special treatment. Some of us paid full fare, and it would be disappointing if others were here on, say, some promotional arrangement. Naomi placed her glass on the table with a deliberate, quiet click. The conversation was no longer background noise. She rose from her seat with unhurried grace, the navy fabric of her travel suit catching the ambient light. Standing in the narrow aisle, she looked down at Eleanor, not with overt anger, but with the kind of measured authority that made the surrounding air feel heavier. "Mrs. Davenport," she said, her voice calm but carrying easily over the subdued cabin noise. "I have not spoken to you until now. I have not interfered with your flight, and yet you seem fixated on my presence here." Eleanor blinked up at her, momentarily caught off guard by the directness. "I'm simply—" "No," Naomi cut in, still soft but firm enough to freeze the words on Eleanor's tongue. "You've questioned my right to sit in this seat. You've questioned the professionalism of the crew. You've made insinuations in front of other passengers. I am asking you, once, to stop." The cabin went very still. Even the man in 3A lowered his phone slightly, sensing the weight of the moment. Eleanor's face tightened. The silence didn't suit her. "I don't appreciate your tone," she snapped, sitting up straighter. "And frankly, I find you threatening." Naomi felt the shift, that dangerous pivot to language meant to weaponize perception. The word threatening had been the last straw before in other stories she'd witnessed. It was a word that could spiral quickly if left unchecked. Her gaze moved to Chloe. "Please go to the flight deck," she said evenly. "Tell the captain the owner is on board, and that we have a Code 3 passenger disturbance." Chloe froze for a fraction of a second, then nodded sharply and walked forward, her heels clicking against the aisle carpet. The temperature in the cabin seemed to drop a degree. Charles looked as if he'd just realized his seatbelt might be the only thing holding him together. Eleanor's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Naomi didn't move. She simply waited. Less than a minute later, the cockpit door opened and Captain Reynolds stepped into the aisle, his crisp uniform and silver hair radiating quiet authority. He didn't glance at Eleanor. His eyes went straight to Naomi. "Dr. Carter," he said, with a slight nod, "I understand we have an issue." Naomi inclined her head. "Thank you for coming, Captain." That was all it took. The titles, the acknowledgement. They told the rest of the cabin everything. Eleanor's voice, when it returned, was shriller. "Captain, I insist this woman be moved. She's making outrageous claims. Naomi didn't look at her. "Captain, I am the controlling owner of this airline. I have asked this passenger to cease harassment of myself and your crew. She has refused." The young man in 3A started recording in earnest now. This was the moment. Captain Reynolds' face was unreadable. "Mrs. Davenport," he said finally, "I'm going to have to ask you and your husband to gather your belongings." Eleanor's expression shifted from indignation to disbelief, her gaze darting around as if expecting someone to intervene. No one did. 2 uniformed security officers appeared at the front of the cabin. Charles closed his eyes. Eleanor started to speak, but her voice broke halfway through the first word. Naomi sat back down, lifted her champagne, and took a slow, deliberate sip as the officers stepped forward. Eleanor's voice returned in bursts, brittle and jagged. "This is absurd, completely absurd. Charles, say something." Charles stood halfway, then sat again, the indecision written plainly in the crease of his brow. His eyes darted from Naomi to the captain, then to the 2 uniformed officers waiting in the galley like patient shadows. "Mrs. Davenport," Captain Reynolds said, still calm but with the faint steel of finality in his tone, "you are being denied travel on this flight due to disruptive behavior and non-compliance with crew instructions. We will be returning to the gate where you will be met by ground security." The murmur that rippled through the cabin was almost imperceptible. Just the small shift of people exchanging glances, the weight of the situation settling in. "This is intimidation," Eleanor said, though her voice was losing the crisp edge she had relied on. "You can't just—" "Ma'am," Reynolds interrupted, not raising his voice but making it impossible to talk over him. "We can. And we will." Chloe reappeared from the galley, this time holding Eleanor's designer tote. "Your bag, ma'am," she said simply, offering it without meeting her eyes. Eleanor snatched it from her hand. "Don't touch my things," she snapped, but the words felt hollow in the charged silence. Richard finally stood, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the last 15 minutes had been a slow, crushing press. "Let's go, Eleanor." "I'm not going anywhere," she hissed, but she didn't stand taller. In fact, Naomi noticed the faint rounding of her spine, the first sign that pride was giving way to inevitability. One of the officers stepped forward, his voice calm, professional. "Ma'am, we'd like to escort you off the aircraft now. If you choose not to cooperate, you could face federal charges for interfering with a flight crew." That landed. Even Eleanor seemed to feel the gravity in those words. She rose abruptly, the motion jolting her champagne glass and sending a few drops over the rim. Charles took her coat from the overhead bin without a word. Naomi kept her gaze on the view outside the window, the jet bridge sliding back into place, the ground crew moving with quiet efficiency. She could hear every rustle and snap of Eleanor's packing, every muttered complaint about lawsuits and phone calls to important people. The passengers in nearby rows watched openly now. There was no pretense of polite disinterest. The man in 1A leaned back, eyes on the ceiling, as though silently thanking the universe that it wasn't him. The woman in sunglasses from row 2 had removed them completely, her expression unreadable but intent. When Eleanor finally stepped into the aisle, her chin was lifted a fraction higher, but her eyes darted anywhere but toward Naomi. Charles followed, head bowed slightly, his face pale. The officers led them toward the front, their presence quiet but unmistakably authoritative. As they reached the doorway, Captain Reynolds stepped aside and gestured toward the open jet bridge. "Safe travels, Mr. and Mrs. Davenport," he said. The words were neutral, but the implication was clear. Their journey on this aircraft was over. The door closed behind them with a solid, sealing thud. For a beat, the cabin remained suspended in a strange, weightless silence. Then Naomi exhaled, slow, measured, and lifted her champagne glass again. Chloe returned, her expression a careful blend of composure and relief. "Apologies for the disturbance, Dr. Carter," she said quietly. "Not your fault," Naomi replied. "You handled it exactly right." The captain's voice came over the PA. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We will be departing shortly." His tone was the same professional baritone it always was, but Naomi caught the faint undercurrent of satisfaction. Around her, passengers adjusted blankets, reopened laptops, and reclaimed the small, private worlds they had inhabited before the incident. But the undercurrent in the air had shifted. There was a quiet respect in the glances Naomi received now, a wordless acknowledgement. She leaned back in her seat, the hum of the engines once again steady and comforting. Outside, the ground crew disconnected the last cables. The man in 3A finally put his phone away, but not before sending one last message. Naomi wondered, briefly, how long it would take before this little episode appeared somewhere online, the video of Eleanor's removal, her own measured words, the quiet power of the moment. It didn't matter. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the rhythm of the aircraft settle her thoughts. This wasn't the first confrontation of its kind she'd endured. It wouldn't be the last. But this one had been a reminder of why she built what she built, of the importance of setting the tone, of the responsibility that came with it. The engine surged, pushing her gently back into her seat. The A350 began its long, steady taxi toward the runway, and Naomi opened her eyes to the horizon ahead. The flight, and whatever waited for her in London, was just beginning. The jet lag hadn't even hit yet when Naomi's phone started buzzing on the marble nightstand of her Connaught Hotel suite. It was barely 6:00 a.m. London time, but she knew exactly who it was before she even reached for it. Marcus Thorne didn't waste time with pleasantries, and if he was calling this early, it meant something had broken loose. "Tell me you're awake," Marcus said, his voice crisp, like he'd been up for hours. "I am now," Naomi replied, stretching under the crisp white sheets. "What's the status?" There was a rustle of papers on his end, and then the unmistakable tone Marcus used when delivering a verdict. "Northgate's board convened last night. Emergency session. Sterling is in damage control mode. The video's at 12 million views and counting. Hashtags all over social media. Your name is trending right next to theirs." Naomi sat up, pulling the duvet around her. And, Marcus continued, "they're ready to make a deal. They're dangling a 7-figure donation to the Urban STEM initiative. They want to fast-track it for PR optics, of course, but that's just the opening move." Naomi smirked faintly. "Sterling's playing the checkbook diplomacy card. How original." "They're also asking for a private sit-down," Marcus said. "Sterling himself, no lawyers, no press, just you and him." Naomi swung her legs out of bed and padded over to the window, looking down at Mayfair slowly coming alive. Delivery trucks, early risers, the faint clink of breakfast service from the cafe across the street. "If we do this, it's on my terms. No rushed absolution. They live with this in the sunlight." "Exactly what I thought you'd say," Marcus replied. "I've already drafted a revised clause for the Vidian contract. Mandatory social responsibility audits, 5 years minimum. Public reporting, no loopholes." Naomi let out a slow breath. "Good. And Chloe?" "Promotion letter's ready. She'll be cabin supervisor by next week. 20% raise. Your personal commendation is on top." "Perfect," Naomi said, a hint of warmth in her tone. "And the kid with the camera? Kevin Luo? He accepted the internship offer. Starts this summer." There was a pause, one of those rare silences between Naomi and Marcus that spoke volumes. "You're turning this into something bigger than punishment," he finally said. "That's the point," Naomi replied. "Revenge is loud, change is quiet, but it lasts longer." By the time Naomi walked into the private dining room of a discreet members-only club in the West End that afternoon, Sterling was already there. He rose from the table, extending his hand, but Naomi merely gave a polite nod before taking her seat. "Dr. Carter," he began, his tone respectful but taut with urgency, "thank you for agreeing to meet." "I'm here because I want to be clear," Naomi said, leaning back in her chair. "This isn't about optics. This is about whether Northgate actually lives the values it puts in its glossy annual reports." Sterling's jaw tightened. "I understand. What happened was unacceptable. Gregory Beaumont has been terminated, effective immediately. The board wanted it on record before we even spoke." Naomi didn't flinch. "And his wife?" "She's not under our jurisdiction, but I can assure you she will have no further association with Northgate in any capacity. Her actions were deplorable." Naomi studied him for a long moment. "Here's how this goes. Vidian Logistics is not walking away today, but Northgate is on probation. For the next 5 years, we'll conduct annual independent audits of your hiring, pay equity, promotion rates for minorities, and training effectiveness. The results will be reviewed by my board and, if I decide, made public." Sterling opened his mouth, but Naomi's voice cut through before he could speak. "This isn't negotiable. You agree, or the $80 million contract renewal is off the table, and I'll make sure every major player in your sector knows exactly why." The silence stretched. Sterling's fingers drummed once against the table before he exhaled slowly. "You'll have it in writing by Friday." Naomi gave a single nod. "Then we're done here." That evening, back in her suite, Naomi finally allowed herself to exhale. The city outside was bathed in golden hour light, the kind that made even London look cinematic. She sipped a glass of wine and thought about the last 48 hours, the confrontation, the fallout, the negotiations. It wasn't victory she felt exactly, more like the solid satisfaction of knowing a principle had been enforced, a line held. Somewhere in the world tonight, There would be executives at Northgate scrambling to implement policies they'd once treated as PR fluff. And there would be people, employees, passengers, strangers online, who'd seen that it was possible to stand your ground without raising your voice. Naomi picked up her phone, scrolling past the headlines, the commentary, the memes that had already spun out of the viral video. Some made her laugh, others made her shake her head. But one stood out, a simple tweet from Kevin Luo. "Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just calmly tells you to get off the plane." Naomi smiled. Maybe the kid was going to be all right. Naomi set her phone down and leaned back into the armchair, the city's hum drifting in through the slightly cracked window. She wasn't someone who lingered on moments. Her instinct was always forward motion. But this deserved a pause. Her mind drifted back to Chloe's face on the plane, that flicker of hesitation before she'd marched to the flight deck. How quickly she'd steadied herself. Naomi had seen dozens of employees in high-stakes situations, but Chloe's composure had been textbook. That was why Naomi had called Marcus within an hour of landing to push her promotion through. Talent like that couldn't be left to chance. The doorbell to her suite rang, a discreet chime. Naomi opened it to find Chloe herself standing there, still in her crew uniform, hair neatly tied back, though her eyes betrayed the exhaustion of a long-haul turnaround. "I didn't want to bother you," Chloe began, "but I needed to say thank you. I heard about the promotion." Naomi stepped aside to let her in. "You earned it. Yesterday could have gone in a dozen ugly directions. You chose the right one." Chloe smiled faintly. "I've dealt with difficult passengers before, but that—" She shook her head. "That was different. She wasn't just being rude. She wanted to make you smaller." Naomi's expression softened. "Some people only know how to feel taller by standing on someone else. Your job isn't to shrink for them, and now as cabin supervisor, you'll be in a position to help others do the same." Chloe nodded, a quiet pride in her eyes. "I'll make sure of it." After Chloe left, Naomi turned back to the window. The street lamps had begun to flicker on, casting warm pools of light over the cobblestone. She thought about the meeting with Sterling, the way he'd tried to mask discomfort with polished corporate language. He'd agreed to her terms, but Naomi knew the real work would be in the follow-through. Words in a contract were one thing. Changing a culture was another. Her phone buzzed again, this time a video call from Marcus. She accepted, and his face appeared, framed by the Manhattan skyline behind him. "You're officially the lead story on 3 major networks," he said, grinning. "Even the morning shows are running segments on the first-class CEO incident." Naomi rolled her eyes, but couldn't help a small smirk. "Catchy." "They're not just talking about the drama," Marcus added. "They're talking about the aftermath. Your conditions with Northgate, Chloe's promotion, the internship for Kevin Luo. You've turned this into a masterclass in reputational judo." "That's the goal," Naomi said. "Make the story about the solution, not just the spectacle." Marcus tilted his head. "You know you could ride this wave. Book deals, speaking tours, corporate training gigs." Naomi's laugh was low. "Maybe. But I'm not interested in being a brand built on someone else's bad behavior. I'd rather keep building the work that makes that behavior harder to survive." They talked for a few more minutes. Updates on pending contracts, a note about an upcoming board meeting, before ending the call. As she prepared for bed, Naomi reflected on the irony. Eleanor Davenport had wanted to make her smaller, to put her in her place. Instead, she'd handed Naomi a bigger platform and a louder voice. But the real victory wasn't in the noise. It was in the quiet, lasting changes already set in motion. And tomorrow, the work would continue. Naomi turned off the lights, the city's glow still seeping through the curtains. Somewhere in the distance, the faint wail of a siren threaded through the night, a reminder that the world beyond her window was still full of conflict, still in need of people willing to stand up, calmly but firmly, and say, "This stops here." The next morning, sunlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Naomi Carter's penthouse office. Central Park stretched below like a living canvas of green and gold, but her gaze wasn't on the view. She was scrolling through the final report Marcus had sent overnight, the Beaumont file in its entirety. Every detail was there: the termination letter from Northgate Holdings, the official statement to the press, social media sentiment tracking that glowed a deep shade of approval for Aura Airlines, and the email from Jonathan Sterling, the Northgate CEO, offering a formal apology and a 7-figure donation to the Urban STEM initiative. Marcus stepped in without knocking. "Sterling's still calling," he said, holding a tablet with the latest message. "He's offering to fly here today, alone, wants 5 minutes of your time." Naomi didn't look up. 5 minutes with me isn't what he needs. Set him up with you legal and DI. If Northgate wants this contract renewed, they'll agree to our new social responsibility audit clause, annual independent reviews of hiring, pay equity, promotion rates for minorities, with us choosing the firm, probation for 5 years, publicly reported summaries. Marcus's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's far more precise than just cutting them off." "Exactly," Naomi said, finally meeting his eyes. "Walking away punishes them once. This forces them to live their brochure values every day. We're not their partner anymore. We're their warden." Marcus gave a slow, approving nod. "And if they refuse?" "Then they were never serious about change, and we walk with a clean conscience." She closed the file and leaned back. The silence in the room was steady, intentional. "And Chloe?" Marcus asked. "Promote her to cabin supervisor," Naomi said without hesitation. 20% raise, commendation from my office. Grace under fire deserves more than applause." Marcus smiled faintly. "And the guy in 3A? Kevin Luo?" "First-class tickets, yes, but also offer him a paid summer internship in corporate communications. If he's willing to stand up for strangers at 30,000 feet, I want him on our team." When Marcus left, Naomi turned back to the window. She thought of Gregory Beaumont, the hollow look in his eyes when security walked him down the jet bridge. She didn't feel satisfaction. Not really. What she felt was weight. The weight of leading 20,000 employees. The weight of knowing that power wasn't just the ability to own an airline. It was the responsibility to define its culture. She remembered being 23, the only black woman in her Caltech doctoral program, being told her physics skills were surprisingly strong. She remembered being 30, pitching her logistics software to a room full of venture capitalists and being asked whose coffee she was there to take. Every time she'd swallowed the sting, turned it into fuel, and kept building. Now, at the absolute apex of her career, she'd learned something humbling. No matter how high you climb, there will always be someone who sees only what they expect to see. And that was why she couldn't let incidents like this slide. She tapped open a blank document and began drafting an internal memo to all Aura Airlines employees, pilots, flight attendants, engineers, gate agents. Subject: our sky, our standards. Yesterday, some of you witnessed or later heard about an incident involving one of our passengers. This is not a story about wealth, titles, or ownership. It is about dignity, the kind that is not negotiable at 35,000 feet or anywhere else. Every person who steps onto one of our aircraft deserves respect. No exceptions. That standard is not just in our service manual, it is in our DNA. If you protect that standard, I will protect you, always. She signed it simply. Naomi Carter, CEO, Aura Airlines. She hit send. Across the city, Chloe's phone buzzed as she sat in a cafe near JFK, replaying the events of the flight in her head. When she opened the email and read the memo, she felt a lump in her throat. She hadn't just done her job. She'd been seen, and somewhere in a Columbia University dorm room, Kevin Luo saw the same email. He smiled, already composing a reply to Marcus accepting the internship offer. In a quiet Connecticut neighborhood, the Beaumont estate stood cold and still. Gregory sat alone in his study, the severance envelope still unopened on his desk. Outside, Caroline was on the phone with yet another lawyer who was politely explaining that suing Naomi Carter was a legal suicide mission. For the first time in 25 years, Gregory didn't try to interrupt her. He just stared out the window, hearing Naomi's calm voice from that day echo in his mind. "I have the plane." It wasn't about the plane, he realized. It was about altitude. Not the kind you measure in feet, the kind you measure in character. By noon, the story had evolved from a trending hashtag to a full-blown media cycle. CNN ran the headline, "CEO calmly removes disruptive first-class passenger," and wins internet applause. The BBC went with, "Viral flight confrontation sparks corporate reform at Northgate Holdings." Even the Wall Street Journal carried it, dry but unmistakable. Contract renewal hinges on social responsibility audit. Naomi didn't court press, but she wasn't naive. She knew the coverage mattered, not for her reputation, but for the message it sent to every corporate boardroom that thought dignity was optional. Her assistant, Dana, stepped in holding a tablet. "Marcus says the first Northgate compliance meeting is set for next Tuesday. They've already hired a third-party audit firm." "That's faster than expected," Naomi said. Dana smiled. Fear is a remarkable motivator. Across the river in New Jersey, in a nondescript office park, Northgate's HR team sat in a cramped conference room, facing the unfamiliar presence of two independent auditors. Clipboards, laptops, and stacks of files cluttered the table. One auditor, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, flipped through the latest diversity report. "Let's start with pay equity. Your own numbers show a 23% gap between white male executives and black female executives at the same level. Explain." The HR director squirmed. We're planning to address that this year." "Now you'll address it this quarter," the auditor said, "and we'll verify." For the first time in years, Northgate's leadership realized the culture they'd kept behind glass doors was now subject to outside air and sunlight. Meanwhile, Chloe was back on duty, her first flight as cabin supervisor. Standing at the boarding door of an Aura A350 bound for Singapore, she greeted passengers with a confidence she hadn't known she was capable of a week ago. A woman in business attire paused and said quietly, "I saw the video. You were incredible." Chloe felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she only smiled and said, "Welcome aboard." Farther down the jet bridge, Kevin Luo adjusted his backpack and approached the gate. He'd never flown business class before, but the upgrade had come with the internship offer. Chloe recognized him instantly. "3A again," she teased. "Seems to be my lucky number," he said, grinning. As the passengers settled in, Chloe thought about the moment on the London flight when everything could have gone sideways, and how a calm voice, not hers, but Naomi's, had set the tone. She carried that with her now, not just as a memory, but as a standard. Back in Manhattan, Naomi's day wound down. The office had emptied, the skyline outside her floor-to-ceiling windows glowing in shades of orange and steel blue. She sat at her desk, a cup of tea cooling beside a stack of untouched papers, and allowed herself a rare moment of stillness. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Northgate signed. All conditions accepted. 5-year term. We won." Naomi replied with a single word, "Good." She swiveled her chair toward the window, watching the city's lights flicker on one by one. She thought about the young version of herself, the one who'd been underestimated in classrooms, in pitch meetings, in boardrooms. She wondered what that woman would think, seeing her now. The irony was, she hadn't set out to become a symbol. She'd only wanted to run her company well, to treat people right, to fly passengers safely from one place to another. But sometimes leadership meant standing up in moments you didn't choose. Moments when silence would be easier, but wrong. A small jet crossed the twilight sky in the distance, its contrail catching the last light. Naomi followed it until it disappeared into the clouds. Tomorrow there would be more work, more negotiations, more flights. But tonight, she let herself sit in the quiet, knowing that somewhere out there, people she'd never meet would step onto a plane, take their seat, and feel, without even realizing why, just a little more welcome. Because dignity travels faster than any aircraft. You know, when I think back on it, the moment that stays with me isn't the raised voices or the sharp words. It's the quiet after the door closed, when the hum of the engines returned and dignity settled back into the air like it had been there all along. In that stillness, you could almost hear the weight of what had just happened. A reminder that sometimes the strongest stand you can take is the one made without shouting. It's a lesson the years have taught me over and over, one that the Black community has carried for generations. You don't have to match someone's disrespect with your own. You can stand in the truth of who you are, speak with calm certainty, and still shift the ground under someone's feet. I've seen that truth in boardrooms, on porches in the summer heat, and yes, in the narrow aisle of an airplane, thousands of feet above the earth. The heart of this story isn't about winning an argument. It's about holding on to your own worth so firmly that no insult, no assumption, no sideways glance can knock it loose. That's what Naomi did up there. She reminded us that dignity isn't a costume you put on when the world is watching. It's the skin you live in every day. And for the Black community, that lesson is stitched into our history. In the church pews, in the marches, in the kitchen tables where elders remind the young to walk tall, even when the road is rough. Because here's the thing, when you meet ignorance with grace, you don't just protect yourself, you set a standard for everyone else in the room. You leave behind a little more light than you found, and you never know who's watching, who's learning, who's going to carry that forward into their own fight. Like the glow of a porch light left on through the night, a steady hand and a calm word can guide more people than you'll ever realize. So maybe take a moment after hearing this story to think about the last time you judged someone by their appearance, and the last time you might have been judged yourself. Think about how the ending could have been different if someone had chosen to pause, to listen, to stand up without knocking someone else down. And if this story has warmed something in you, maybe share that warmth with someone else who could use it today. Because in a world that's quick to divide, we could all use more of the steady, quiet courage that holds its ground, and more hands willing to pass that light along.